Hello and welcome everyone to this episode of Spotlight. The waters off the coast of Venezuela are heating up, not from the tropical sun, but from the engines of American warships. The USS Gerald Ford, a floating city of military might, now patrols Latin American seas. Force the Pentagon claims is there to fight narco-terrorists. But in Caracas, this is seen for what it is, the latest and most dangerous chapter in the long history of American imperialism and regime change operations. President Trump says he has sort of made up his mind about Venezuela, while his forces have already killed dozens in unilateral strikes. Meanwhile, President Maduro has mobilized the nation, vowing to defend Venezuelan sovereignty against what he calls the American empire. So is this a genuine counter-narcotics operation or a manufactured pretext for invasion? And most importantly, are we witnessing the prelude to another U.S.-led war for oil and geopolitical dominance? Tonight, we explore these questions and more as we listen to the rising drums of the war in the Caribbean. To analyze these new developments, we are joined by Mr. Don DeBar, activist and commentator, joining us from New York. And Mr. Jesus Rodriguez, a former Venezuelan diplomat, joining us from Caracas. Well, gentlemen, I'd like to thank both of you for joining us during this episode of Spotlight. Mr. DeBar, I do want to go ahead and start off with you with the first question. In concerning with the U.S.'s justification, of course, for this massive deployment, which is to combat, according to them, drug trafficking. Now, given what we mentioned in the lead about the USS Ford's capabilities, now this is designed for state-on-state warfare. How credible is this explanation? What is it really driving this escalation, in your opinion, Mr. DeBar?
Okay, what's the objective, first of all, of the military action or whatever action follows? That has to be the first question, and then you assign, wherewithal to realize the task and measure it, whether or not it's appropriate, whether or not it's functioning properly and effective. So if you're starting out with an invasion task force, it's clear that the purpose is either invasion or threat of invasion. In other words, some psychological terrorism. Holding out the rationale of drug smuggling for inducing this presentation of arms leaves one bewildered with the contradictions that abound in that region, including Colombia up until recently. There's drug smuggling across the Andes, cocaine, heroin. You have marijuana and other similar products that come in from Mexico and elsewhere. There's been a running joke in the United States that if you wanted to smuggle a thermonuclear device into the United States, the best way to do it would be to hide it in a shipping container full of cocaine, because no one would ever find it. The task in front of the U.S. government, whether it's Trump, Biden, Obama, whomever, in relation to Venezuela at the time, is to try to gain control of the resources of Venezuela in the world markets. We're at a particularly volatile period globally in terms of the international order, seems to be at least tipping or at least dripping into perhaps an epical change, certainly some very deep slides along regional fault lines. And so as perhaps they withdraw from attempting direct military action to Russia on the one hand or elsewhere outside of the Western Hemisphere, they want to consolidate their position here and maybe work their way towards those three great sheets that George Orwell wrote about in 1984. I don't know, but it seems like Trump is trying to satisfy the warmongering people here with arms sales and to consolidate the U.S.'s position in Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, well, on that point, let's go ahead and bring in Mr. Rodriguez. Thank you for your patience very much, Mr. Rodriguez. As a former Venezuelan diplomat, I would like to direct this question to you. How do you analyze Maduro's response to the tense situation, specifically that he is seeing that his only option is resistance?
Yes, I believe that the response from the state as a whole has been pretty responsible and aligned with what we Venezuelans, most Venezuelans, believe is necessary, which is first he called for a voluntary enlistment for the Bolivarian militia, and that call was responded massively by Venezuelans. The government talked about 3 million new enlisted members of the militia, so that was amazing. So right now, the number of militia in Venezuela should be somewhere around 6 or 7 million people. And with that came these additional exercises, I mean, military drills and military training for the new enlisted militia members and for the, previously enlisted militia members. And those drills has been happening since August, since late August, and has been done in a very responsible way without creating alarm among the population, letting us know that we has been, threats or by the U.S. government, and there is an imminent military threat, but asking us to do not abandon our daily lives, to continue working, to continue doing what we used to do. And meanwhile, all these military drills and military training has been happening with an added value, which is this strengthening of the interconnection between the military, the militia, which is one branch of the army, and the communal councils, the communal power, as we call it here in Venezuela. And that has been happening a lot in recent weeks, in recent days. And that is somehow amazing, because if you ask me, I would never imagine this, integration between these three institutions. And it has happened in a very fast pace because of the threat. So the response has been very responsible. The Venezuelan people the majority of the Venezuelan people reject these U.S. threats, and we are preparing for everything without abandoning our, work and our, daily routine.
Of course. Well, Mr. DeBar, Mr. Rodriguez mentioned some very important parts that this has been going on for some time. The U.S. has focused on internal security in Venezuela for years. Has this compromised their ability to wage a conventional war against an external enemy, in your opinion, Mr. DeBar?
Well, the way Venezuelan society and Venezuela's defenses are organized, a conventional military, attack and occupation would be very, very costly. The point of taking Venezuela, taking control of Venezuela, imposing regime change or whatever, is to have some lever of control over the oil and other natural resources out in the world markets. The people will burn whoever comes into Venezuela, so they're not going to be able to manage and control the resources there. Look at Vietnam, where the whole people ended up being the army defending the country. Look at how Cuba has forestalled an invasion since 1961, but for exactly the same reason. The Committees for Defensive Revolution have organized the people that they have to whack the soldiers with rakes or whatever is available, baseball bats. They're prepared to do it to defend their homes. Venezuela is organized in a similar way, along with very formidable regional, level conventional military defenses. And so I don't see any possibility of an action. Look, they could do something stupid. There's a long history of that. The whole planet has been doing stupid since we've arrived on it, however we got here. And so, I don't say that it's impossible that they'll do something this way, off the ranch, but I don't see it within the real viable options for a successful project from the point of view of bringing Venezuela's resources into the West's orbit by a conventional military attack. It'll be very costly in terms of manpower, which will produce perhaps an uprising in the United States almost immediately. It'll be very costly also in terms of their military resources in the region, and could in fact inflame an uprising in the entire Western Hemisphere. So I think it's much too dangerous for them to even risk that. And I think the people on the ground in Venezuela are aware of that fact because it happens to be true.
Yes, and Mr. Rodriguez, I mean, as Mr. DeBar, our guest from New York, did mention that the Venezuelans, and as you did previously mention, are willing to do anything to protect your sovereignty, your security, as any independent nation will, specifically against these continued U.S. threats. Mr. Rodriguez, I mean, how is this U.S. buildup being viewed not only in Venezuela, but of course by other Latin American nations? For our viewers who haven't been catching up on the news, let's remind them we also have, other than President Maduro, we also have Colombia's president, Mr. Petro, who also has been very highly critical of the U.S. moves. Mr. Rodriguez, how crucial is Colombian stance, Venezuela's stance, and is there a risk of any regional destabilization, in your opinion?
Yes, there's already regional destabilization in the region. I mean, with this, you know, extrajudicial killings led by the U.S. military. I mean, nationals from Venezuela, Colombia, Trinidad and Tobago, and a survivor from Ecuador and maybe from Mexico that we don't know too much about that survivor. I mean, they are already nationals from several countries in the region that have been victim of the, killing spree of the U.S. Southcom. So that already creates tension in the region, and the evidence of that tension in diplomatic terms is the growth in the number of signatories of a letter that was signed by most of the CELAC countries like 6 or 7 weeks ago. And if you compare that with the final declaration of the recent CELAC EU summit in Santa Marta, you will notice that more countries from the region signed a declaration that was very similar to the previous letter. So that's an evidence that many countries are worried about the repercussions of this new U.S. military tirade in the region. And recently, even countries that are not pretty sympathetic with Venezuela, like the government of Panama and Chile, issue statements, worry about the U.S. military escalation. And of course, Colombia. I mean, even President Petro, which is an amazing president, if you put it in the context of Colombia, is the first progressive president that country has in its history. President Petro was pretty critical of President Maduro a few months ago, but with all these attacks, especially when the U.S. military killed Colombian people, he began to act more, to be more outspoken about the U.S. operation in the region, and that have created some sort of alliance, tacit alliance between Venezuela and Colombia in the face of the U.S. aggression. So the tension is high, and if the U.S. escalation and killing spree in the region continue, the tension will grow. And actually, a few hours ago, the Trinitarian government announced that tomorrow they are going to launch new military drills with the U.S. Army. So the situation is pretty tense, and the tension it will certainly grow if the U.S. do not realize that what they're doing is wrong.
Well, exactly. It is a very tense situation, as you are clearly explaining there, Mr. Rodriguez. And this is why the world and our viewers need to listen specifically on this episode of Spotlight what's really going on when media around the world is not covering it as it should be. While Mr. Rodriguez was clearly explaining for everyone, for our viewers, the situation there in the region of Latin America, I do want to come back to Mr. DeBar. Mr. DeBar, you mentioned earlier a bit on the domestic level there in the U.S. As you are joining us, just a reminder to our viewers from New York, with the low U.S. U.S. public supporting any kind of support for the U.S. military action, whether in Venezuela or other countries. I mean, what is the domestic political calculation for President Trump? Is this escalation more about domestic politics than foreign policy, perhaps?
It's hard to parse which is which at this moment. It's clear that the international order is undergoing a somewhat accelerated reordering. It's difficult, people use conventional historical terms about, decaying empires and, rising this and et cetera. And these terms explain some things, but they're inadequate to a new situation where usually the terminology is created and in analyzing what has happened, that's novel or new. Trump's domestic situation is, to the extent that, all our contact with all of this is virtual, not firsthand, and certainly I've never sat in on any meetings of the people who run the world, so I don't know, what I'm thinking about what I see and how close to reality they are. But Trump seems to be representing a faction inside the ruling class that has a particular style in mind for managing their construct, empire, whatever you want to call it, moving forward. That's a change in style and form and perhaps somewhat in essence. Certainly concentration of wealth and power increasing and becoming universal as a goal is still, on their agenda. Certainly starting with control of the rather impressive set of resources at their fingertips already, is for either case also. Trump assembled the Trump campaign in 2016 and orbital campaigns in the political sphere here, assembled a coalition that was rather, first that was novel. There was a lot of detritus from various coalitions that had collapsed inside the Democratic and Republican parties, in and around unions, small business, et cetera. And also, though, he had challenged, particularly publicly, for the first time in maybe 50 years, the idea of the U.S. military as the policeman of the world and the United States as the capital of the world, and that instead we would be first among equals in a way, rather than being the dominant power. He has shown, excuse me.
No worries, take your time, yes.
In his presidency, we've seen that what's been promised isn't always deliverable, forgetting his intent. The politicians here mouth words that are intended to stimulate activity in the electorate. And so once they've gotten power, whatever, through elections or public opinion consensus, et cetera, now we put that aside and do what we intended to do and hope we don't damage it so we can pick it up after this is over. Trump is standing on one leg on a banana peel and an oil slick in some ways.
Well, exactly. Mr. DeBar, if you don't mind me cutting you off, you did mention the oil. I do want to get at least a few more questions in before our time runs out. Right. Mr. Rodriguez, our guest mentioned the oil situation. And again, for our viewers to completely understand that this is the #1 reason, as many people know around the world, no matter the mask is there on Trump, we know the U.S. policies, we know their foreign policies, we know why wars have been caused in Iraq and countries across the world. Venezuela holds currently the world's largest proven oil reserves. How would a conflict impact not only the Venezuelan people there, Mr. Rodriguez, but also global oil prices and the world economy if the U.S. does decide to attack?
It will impact oil prices, of course. Right now, because of U.S. sanctions, Venezuela is not in its peak of production, but we have been improving production in recent months. And right now we are well above 1 million barrels per day, but we traditionally produce between 2.5 and 3 million barrels per day. So the impact will not be the similar impact that if an event like this happened in West Asia, but it's going to have an impact. Actually, a few days ago, there was an increase in the Western Texas marker, which is the marker that is closest to the Venezuelan type of oil, so the impact will be very great. Just to add a little bit to that, to what my counterpart in the U.S. just talked about, right now it's evident that everything that is happening, what President Trump did at the first days after he took office, make a lot of sense. I mean, he talked about Greenland, he talked about Panama, he talked about the Gulf of Mexico. He made statements that then were not very connected and look like crazy. But right now, it makes a lot of sense because most analysts, value that this aggression against Venezuela, this military, tirade in the region, is pretty connected to the, you might not call it decline, but the loss of preeminence of the U.S. in the world as a whole. So because of that, many analysts say that the U.S. decided to, put their hands back in the region that they usually have traditionally considered as its backyard. So that's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons that explain what is happening right now.
Exactly, Mr. Rodriguez. I apologize. I do have around 30 more seconds. I would like to quickly direct my last question to Mr. DeBar. 30 seconds, if you please, sir. What is the end game for the United States? I mean, is the regime change the only acceptable outcome, or is there any type of off-ramp or diplomatic solution that they would accept, in your opinion?
Well, it depends on how the global realignment plays out. I can see a possibility, for example, of Ukraine being turned off, of the threat against Taiwan being turned off, of a sort of 3 regions or 4 or 5 regions, including Africa and other, far east, basically where people are allowed to tend to their own backyards and work out their business on the ground. There's the Chinese concept of win-win. That's quite possible to do. There's what we saw with CELAC and all of the multilateral organizations in the Western Hemisphere as possible models also. And if you can find a way to apply all the resources here to the talent and capital that's been accumulated here and not have it eat humanity in the process, you could actually see a model for developing the world come out of this that doesn't involve a major war and involves solving a lot of the problems of humanity. Or it could go up in smoke in an accident tomorrow.
Well, on that point, I'd like to thank both of you gentlemen for joining us during this episode of Spotlight. From New York, activist and commentator Mr. Don DeBar, and of course from Caracas, a former Venezuelan diplomat, Mr. Jesus Rodriguez. A pleasure to have you both. Well, viewers, thank you very much for watching this episode of Spotlight. Goodbye.